So good afternoon and welcome to our second National Advisory Council meeting for this year. For those of you who are new to the council, I'm Jackie O'Garrow and I co-chair NAC alongside my good friend and former colleague Barry Zegas. And many of you know Barry. He's a senior fellow with the Consumer Federation of America, as well as principal of Zegas and Associates. On behalf of the National Housing Conference, I want to thank everyone who has joined the call today. And our plan for the day, you all should have received an agenda. But back in June, we tackled a lot of important issues during that meeting, including the industry's response to COVID-19, the Black homeownership gap, CRA, and other important housing issues. Those issues are still current today, so I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion from each of you. But what is most important, or is particularly exciting for me today, is we are going to be joined by Federal Reserve Board Governor Lael Brainard, who's going to discuss CRA modernization following the Fed's recent advance notice of the proposed rulemaking, as well as the larger housing landscape in the United States today. But before we hear from David and Governor Brainard, I want to hand it over to my co-chair, Barry. Barry.
Thank you, Jackie, and welcome everybody who's been able to join us here today. I want to reiterate the sentiments Jackie shared and say we're delighted that so many of you are here today. Everyone's got busy schedules and plenty of Zoom calls, and we're pleased that you chose to make one of them this call today. Also, a great thank you to NHC, David, and the rest of the team for organizing the call and arranging for us to hear from Governor Brainard, which is a great opportunity for all of us to hear from one of the really key leaders in national finance and fiscal policy. It's another sign of how our new leadership has brought NHC to new and well-earned prominence as a premier voice for housing in the nation's capital. As you can tell by having reviewed the agenda, we have a full lineup of pressing issues to discuss. We'll cover the state of CRA modernization, including the OCC's final rule, the Fed's recent proposal, and the FDIC's position. There is a lot of work that lies ahead for the industry in terms of getting to a place where regulators are aligned in a consistent approach to CRA modernization that's clear and easy to follow while preserving the letter and spirit of the original statute, particularly in these times where there's appropriately heightened attention to challenges of equity, inclusion, racial diversity throughout our industry and in our communities, and in the means by which we finance housing and community development. NHC will be working with our members to put up a detailed response to the Federal Reserve Board's ANPR. Please let David know if you'd like to participate. And later today, we're also going to pick up where we left off on the discussion of a 12-point plan to create 3 million Black homeowners by 2030. All of our NAC members will have a chance to participate in the conversation today. And I know all of us who've worked on planning it hope you'll find it valuable and take advantage of this unique forum to discuss pressing issues with fellow housing leaders. Don't forget that the National Housing Conference is the oldest housing coalition in America. Founded in 1931, NHC was formed as an unlikely coalition of housing advocates, labor unions, and home builders, as well as social reformers coming out of the era of the 1920s and 30s. Our slogan, housing is jobs and jobs is housing, is as relevant today as it was nearly 90 years ago. This advisory council is where NHC's thought leaders examine the issues that define current housing policy and explore how we navigate the future. It's a terrific resource for the management and other board members who participate to help set our course and consider alternatives. NAC members represent the full spectrum of NHC's membership, including developers, lenders, national associations, advocacy organizations, and public entities, continuing in the spirit of a broad coalition. The Advisory Council also includes members of the NHC Executive Committee. The meetings are generally not open to the public, as those of you who attended before know, but we're pleased to welcome all of you joining this afternoon, including members of the media watching a live stream on NHC's Facebook page. When we meet in person, we usually go around the table to introduce ourselves. To make this easier, Jackie and I are going to introduce our members, and when we get to the Q&A portion of the program, please remember to introduce yourself as well. So I'm going to recognize the new members of the Advisory Council with us today. And when I say your name, I'd like to ask each of you to say just a few words, and I mean just a few words, to sort of introduce yourself to the rest of the National Advisory Council. So let me start with Patty Arviello from New American Funding. Is Patty with us? Christopher Bell is joining the council at this meeting, and he will be, sorry, Chris is with the Conservation Fund. Chris, are you with us? Akila Watkins Butler with the Center for Community Progress. Is Akila on? Rafael Sestero from the Community Preservation Corporation. Lot Diaz from Unidos US. Tatiana Gutierrez with Nixon Peabody. Hayapin Im, I hope I pronounced that correctly, with Faith and Community Empowerment. Norena Limon with the National Association of Hispanic Real Estate Professionals. Catherine Monet, the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans. Marietta Rodriguez, NeighborWorks America. Pam Potnow. Pam, are you on? Lisa Rice, President of National Fair Housing Alliance. Joanna Shapiro at BNY Mellon, and Anthony Weekly at Truist. Jackie, over to you.
Well, Barry, I see that Marietta and Norena and Lisa are on, so maybe you guys would like to say hello before I jump in with my list. Who wants to go first? Norena, let's go with you first.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. I'm Norena Limon, and I'm the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Industry Relations with NAREP. And our organization is comprised of real estate professionals ranging from realtors, loan officers, home builders, the entire gamut of the housing industry with a mission to advance sustainable Hispanic homeownership. So excited to be here with everybody.
Thank you, Norena. How about you, Lisa?
Hello, I'm Lisa Rice, President and CEO of the National Fair Housing Alliance. Our members are private and public fair housing organizations throughout the United States of America, and our mission is to eliminate all forms of housing discrimination and expand equal housing opportunities.
Marietta?
Good afternoon, everyone. Marietta Rodriguez. I'm the President and CEO of NeighborWorks America. We support a network of more than 240 organizations locally based across the country, focused on community development and creating opportunities for safe, decent, affordable housing. We also we're one of the largest providers in the community development field, and I'm excited to be with you today.
Thank you, Marietta. And I think Tatiana.
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Tatiana Gutierrez, an affordable housing partner at Nixon Peabody.
Well, welcome. It's a pleasure for us to have you. Your voice is going to be very important to our discussions today, so thank you. Is there anyone else that is new to the council that is online?
Good afternoon. This is Anthony Weekly with Truist Mortgage, and I'm head of strategic growth. Pleasure to be on the call today.
Well, thank you.
Welcome,
Pleasure.
Anthony.
Okay, so I'm here to recognize our returning members. Tia Boatman Patterson, California Housing Finance Agency. Ted Chandler, AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust. Cindy Chetty, the National Multifamily Housing Council. Susan Dewey, Virginia Housing Development Agency. Dwayne Duncan, Genworth Financial. Eileen Fitzgerald, Wells Fargo Foundation. Julia Gordon, National Community Stabilization Trust. Courtney Hodak, JP Morgan Chase and Company. David Jeffers, First Story, LLC. Chrissy Johnson, Quicken Loans. Lindsay Johnson, U.S. Mortgage Insurers. Hal Keller, Bill Kilmer, Mortgage Bankers Association. Angie Garcia Lathrop, Bank of America. David Ledford, National Association of Home Builders. Jim Logue, Sinair. Linda Mandolini, Eden Housing, Inc. Mike Mantle, Morgan Stanley. Ann Segrist McCullough, Housing Partnership Equity Trust. Dan Nissenbaum, Low Income Investment Fund. Steve O'Connor, Mortgage Bankers Association, Ralph Perry, Tennessee Housing Development Agency, Christopher Tomey, Urban Land Institute, Marilyn Rivera, Community Development Trust, Dan Solomon, AARP, Steve Thomas, Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago, Brian Tracy, Bank of America, and Connie Wright, Wells Fargo. Now, would all of you believe me if I said I remembered them all by heart? Thank you all for joining us today. And to David, to you.
Thank you, Jackie, and thank you, Barry. I also want to recognize our board chair, Ann McCullough. We are long overdue for a comprehensive and holistic approach to housing policy. It may turn out to be the understatement of the year to say that the legislative agenda for 2021 will be crowded. While we are a nonpartisan organization, we also need to be prepared for the possibility of a so-called blue wave that would present both new opportunities and challenges. Maintaining unity among housing leaders is going to be more important than ever because a new administration's agenda is going to be crowded with many priorities. While housing is all that we do, that will not be the case in the White House. Presenting no drama solutions rather than a wide field of competing factions will separate issues along lines of do it now and deal with it later. A lot of great work has been taking place in many work streams to think through what needs to be done to address long-standing as well as emerging housing needs. This proposal seeks to bring much of this work together on a common platform that can attract what I call reasonably bipartisan support. Not 50-50, which is probably not realistic in today's political environment, but credibly bipartisan nonetheless. So now is the time for you to thoroughly review these recommendations and let us know where we missed that mark or what we've left off. This is a discussion draft in the truest sense of the word, and your feedback is an essential part of this process. I hope to hear from as many of you as possible between now and the end of next month so we can present a final draft to our board and begin to work on a broader set of consultations with policymakers across the country. So now let's take a quick look at the COVID-19 housing resource site. NHC has compiled COVID-19 resources from every facet of the housing industry, so you're never more than one click away from the information you need. As many of us experienced early in the pandemic, dozens and now hundreds of websites contain valuable information on COVID-19 and housing, but there's also significant overlap. Keeping up with all of it can easily consume hours of every day. To address this issue, NHC created a consolidated resource center that allows visitors to search for needed information by issue area, keywords, geography, and chronology. So I'm going to share my screen and share with you this site. I think everybody can see it now. Mm-hmm. So the COVID-19 site today has over 1,100 individual resources that are sorted by tabs, as you can see here, that each go to a individual source of information. So you can see here, some of them have been added in the last few days. Others have been added months ago, and they're listed in this page on chronological order. So it's easy to identify something that's new. But if you are searching for something specific, you can search either by subject matter or by location or by keyword using the search engine. And in subject matter, for instance, if we look at, say, homeless service providers, now we've gone from 1,100 sources of information to 132 that focus on information relevant to homeless service providers. And if I want to go deeper and say I'm in California and looking at California resources, I can go to my local drop-down menu, click on California, and now here are the 17 resources, 2 of which were just added in the last day. And you can see that this is a mix of government information, studies, information from various nonprofits, and also newspaper articles that are relevant to the topic. So we'll go back up to the main page again, and you can see also this is true if we're, for instance, looking at information for renters. Now, we don't have, this is not a consumer site, but there's a lot of consumer information out there, and it's on a wide range of sites. And so our page often comes up in search engines, and you can see here for renters who need help, there's 380 resources here. And again, if I'm say need help and I narrow this by location, say in Texas, where we actually get a lot of consumers coming onto the site looking for help, here are 22 resources in Texas, some of which were added a few weeks ago. One here is the Texas Supreme Court, which recently ruled on the CDC rent moratorium, eviction moratorium. That information is here. And so you'll also notice it comes up in a separate tab. So that allows people to move around in that tab, but also come back to their search. If I go back again to the home page, you'll see also at the top of the page are other tabs, one of which is frequently asked questions. Now, there are fact files among the 1,100 resources, but if you're just looking at lists of FAQs, you can go on this page and see, for instance, specific FAQs for nonprofits or for homeless service providers or for homeowners, for instance, in the multifamily housing industry. And these are FAQs that we've drawn from sites all over the country. And again, each one of those FAQ resources will take you back to their page in a separate tab, so you can then explore those FAQs independently or go back to your search. And then we also have been doing original work on best practices, and I just want to recognize Gina Matrakis and Hollis Daniels, who've done some incredible work on this. And these we update about once a week, and have examples of individual best practices that we've worked with the organization on how they've addressed specific problems. And I want to really encourage everybody who's on this call, if you have a best practice that you think should be featured here, let us know. We are happy to work with you. We want to feature it. One of the most interesting elements of this is, in fact, a page we call the oxygen mask rule. And for those of us who vaguely remember flying in an airplane, it seems like it's been about 10 years, you know, they always make an announcement that when the masks come down, you want to, now there's another metaphor. Wow, okay. When the masks come down from the ceiling, because there's been a drop in air pressure, they say, put the mask on yourself first so you can help others. And I wrote a blog post about this and what I thought was a slow news week in housing. And it became like the most opened blog post I'd ever written. And so there's obviously a lot of interest and need here. We are all working so many hours and working so hard to help people so desperately in need. And it's really important that we focus on the fact that we have to take care of ourselves, because, you know, the old saying is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. We're way past a marathon. We're like an ultra marathon territory now. And we need to pay attention to that. So there's a lot of resources here on meditation, on exercise, on coping with stress that I think will be useful for both you and your staffs. And I just want to encourage that as well. So please take a look at the site, and really, again, appreciate the work of the team and all the feedback that we've been getting from all of you. With that, I want to just also take a minute and put in a plug for NHC membership. It's an opportunity to remind everyone that the National Housing Conference has launched our membership drive. Our work at NHC has never been more important, and we hope it's never been more relevant and impactful for you and your organization. Your intellectual capital is your most important contribution, but without your financial support, we can't use it to your advantage on behalf of the American home. Renewing your membership or joining now will help NHC prepare for what is going to be a very highly impactful 2021 that will likely influence the future of housing policy for the decade ahead. If you're not a member, there's never been a better time to join. If you are currently an NHC member, you will soon receive an email with links to your NHC 2021 membership dues invoice, but you don't have to wait. You can join or renew now on our website at nhc.org. Your support has never been more appreciated or more important. We know that your budget demands getting the maximum value out of every dollar. And I hope that our work this year places NHC at the top of your priority list. I'd also like to remind everyone that our signature housing policy conference, Solutions for Affordable Housing, will take place on December 1st. There is more information on our website, but I will say it promises to be a timely and information-filled day featuring discussions and about coming policy opportunities and changes. I will also note that our first policy conference was in 1934, and Eleanor Roosevelt was our keynote speaker, and she brought Averell Harriman and Harold Ickes with her. So I don't know if we're going to meet that mark, but that's what we're shooting for. I also want to offer my very deep appreciation and gratitude for the support of our major funders, JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, and Bank of America. Your generous and flexible support this year really makes all of this possible. And then we've got a couple minutes before we start with Governor Brainard, and I just want to really emphasize what an important and difficult and really transformational year this has been for so many of us in the affordable housing world and housing in general. And I also want to say that we have found in every recession since 1960, with the single exception of the last one, that housing was played a major role in leading our economy out of recession. And I think that when we look at our housing production numbers for every income range except the highest level, we've fallen short over the last 10 years. And this has been a real problem, but it's also a major opportunity. And I think that as we look at our economy moving forward, and we really are moving into one of the most challenging phases of this pandemic, there are a lot of people, millions of people who have lost their jobs in industries where there may not be a company to go back to. And so some folks are going to find it fairly easy to go back to work. Others are not. And I think housing construction and development is going to be a really important area for us to think about. It is an area where you do not need a college degree and where training is manageable, and there are a lot of different roles possible. And so there really is a double opportunity for us to grow our economy and address our affordable housing shortages. And I think that's going to be really important. I also want to put in a plug for advocating for rental assistance and assistance for homeowners. This is another area that we've been very involved in. We've been working with many of you. Moratoriums are fine because we don't want to see people evicted in the midst of a pandemic, but it is not enough. People need to get their rent paid. And this is a crisis that has occurred through no fault of their own. And I think it's just essential that all of our political leaders get together and reach agreement on support for both renters and homeowners to avoid what could be a horrific eviction cliff, potentially in January, in the middle of winter, and at the height of a pandemic. And finding the political will to address this issue, it's essential for tenants and homeowners. It's also essential for landlords, over half of whom are small businesses. And I don't think we want hedge funds owning half of our housing stock. And the time to avoid that is right now. So with that, let me just see if Governor Brainard is with us.
Hey, David, can I just ask all the folks,
Yes.
it's Linda Mandolini.
Yes, Linda, please.
So nice to see such a great turnout. And, I was just thinking maybe folks, if you could in the chat, I'm just curious because we hail from different parts of the country and different interest groups, sort of put up your what's the biggest challenge you're seeing with COVID and maybe what you think the biggest opportunity might be. I think it would be interesting for us to get some feedback. And so just, I'll just speak for Eden. We actually really see the digital divide as a significant issue, given the people that we house here in the United States, and really think we need to push to make sure that technology plays a bigger role for the low income families and seniors that we serve. And so we see it as a current threat, but we also see it as a significant long-term opportunity. But it would be great if folks could just put up in the chat, if you get a couple minutes in this meeting, kind of what you're thinking about with COVID, because we think it's kind of a double-edged thing.
That's a great idea, and we'll be, and any comments and questions in the chat will be great. If we can ask everybody to hide your video, except for Governor Brainard, and we will also, I'm going to make sure we're in speaker view. We are, and with that, I see that Governor Brainard is here, and I am very pleased and honored to introduce her. She is a member of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, where, as we know, she has led efforts to modernize CRA. Prior to her appointment to the board, Dr. Brainard served as Undersecretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury from 2010 to 2013, and Counselor to the Secretary of the Treasury in 2009. From 2001 to 2008, Dr. Brainard was Vice President and the founding director of the Global Economy and Development Program, and held the Bernard L. Schwartz Chair at the Brookings Institution, where she built a new research program to address global economic challenges. Dr. Brainard served as the Deputy National Economic Advisor and Deputy Assistant to President Clinton. She also served as President Clinton's personal representative to the G7 and G8. She also taught applied economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's Sloan School of Management. And she's a graduate of Wesleyan University and holds a PhD in economics from Harvard University. It's an impressive set of experiences, and anybody who's worked with her has seen all of this experience in action. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce and offer a warm, albeit muted, welcome to Governor Lael Brainard. Thank you for joining us.
Well, I want to thank you very much for inviting me to join you, and also for staying so engaged. I'm going to give a little update on CRA modernization, and in particular with reference to how that process might be able to contribute to addressing the housing challenges facing minority and low and moderate income communities around the country. And, I really look forward to hearing from your members either today or in the future in light of the NHC's important vantage point on housing and community development all around the country. During the mortgage foreclosure crisis, many families around the country suffered the devastating loss of their home through no fault of their own, and home ownership rates still haven't recovered for those groups to pre-crisis levels. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic is raising a new set of challenges for renters and the rental market. It's hitting LMI households with limited financial resources the hardest, and that's especially true for Black and Latinx households. The Census Household Pulse Survey indicates that 25% of Black renters and 22% of Hispanic renters were behind on their rent payments as of September, along with 12% of white renters. And survey data finds that among homeowners, Black and Hispanic households have been significantly more likely to defer or miss monthly mortgage payments and experience uncertainty about making next month's payment than white households during the pandemic. In the initial stages of the crisis, CARES Act emergency payments and supplemental unemployment benefits provided vital support to households. And the mortgage forbearance in the Act, along with eviction moratoriums, have provided vital stopgap stability for many families. But I'm hearing growing concern about what will happen to individuals who may be behind on their rent or mortgage payments as a result of job loss or reduced hours when eviction moratoriums and mortgage forbearance programs come to an end, especially given the uncertainty about additional fiscal support. Of course, those COVID-19 related challenges are layered on top of already substantial challenges in both the homeownership and rental markets. Affordable housing, as all of you know well, is vital, and the need has grown at a much faster pace than the supply. With limited supply of lots and a variety of other challenges, new construction has been disproportionately oriented to higher end units, leaving more limited supply at higher prices for households with lower incomes, especially in higher cost areas. Many households haven't been able to purchase a home since the last financial crisis, due not only to the higher prices, but also stricter underwriting standards. And for those who have purchased a home, those higher prices have translated into higher debt burdens. For renters, subsidies and programs for affordable housing have fallen short of the needs, particularly in those high cost areas. As a result, families are paying a high share of their income for housing, leaving them little to no room left to save for emergencies, such as the one they're confronting today. ACS data from last year show that 45% of renter households spent more than 30% of their monthly income on rent, 22% more than half of their income, and this figure jumps to nearly 38% for renters earning below $50,000. For all these reasons, it's essential to strengthen the incentives in the CRA for the production and rehabilitation of affordable housing. CRA also plays a vital role in encouraging access to credit for homeownership for LMI households and communities, providing chances to build wealth through home equity. Indeed, mortgage lending has long been at the center of evaluating CRA performance. The challenges facing LMI and minority renters and would-be homeowners underscore the importance of getting CRA modernization right. The Federal Reserve unanimously voted to approve an advance notice of proposed rulemaking, an ANPR, on CRA modernization in September. And yesterday it was published in the Federal Register notice. By providing a 120-day comment period, we hope to receive comments from a wide range of stakeholders. And just so you remember, the comment period will end on February 16th, 2021. Throughout the development of the ANPR, we've gotten a lot of really valuable insights into the unique role and needs of affordable housing providers from NHC members through both detailed comment letters and meetings. The CRA, as everyone in this group knows, is a critical law enacted along with complementary federal civil rights laws during the late 60s and 70s. And the intent was to address redlining and systemic inequities in access to credit and other financial services for LMI and minority communities. That core purpose remains as important as ever, especially given the national conversation we're having about racial equity and the disproportionate impact that COVID-19 is having on minority and LMI communities. Even with those critical laws, that the wealth gap remains stubbornly wide. And for many American families, wealth is essentially homeownership. Last year, the homeownership rate for Black households was 42%, as compared to 73% for white households. That homeownership gap of over 31% has widened by over 3 percentage points over the past decade. The ANPR seeks to advance the core purpose of addressing unequal access to credit for LMI and minority communities and disinvestment in underserved communities. A modernized CRA should help to move the needle on credit access, wealth building, and the availability of community development financing. It should include strengthening the regulations to ensure a wide range of low-income and minority banking needs are being met. It should also include promoting financial inclusion by providing incentives for further bank investments in MDIs and CDFIs, as well as for community development in designated areas of need outside of assessment areas such as Indian country. The ANPR seeks to provide greater certainty, tailor regulations based on bank business size and business model and local context, and minimize burden. For example, it introduces a metrics-based approach where appropriate that would separately evaluate retail lending and community development financing. The use of standardized metrics where appropriate would provide greater clarity and transparency on how lending and investment is evaluated. They would also use thresholds that are tailored to local market conditions while retaining a focus on targeted performance context factors. Finally, stakeholders, including the NHC, have expressed strong support for the agencies to work together to modernize CRA by reflecting stakeholder views, and providing a long public comment period. We believe the ANPR provides the basis for the agencies to converge on a consistent approach that has broad support. So before wrapping up, I want to highlight a few proposals in the ANPR that have particular relevance to affordable housing. First, the ANPR proposes 2 separate tests for evaluating the CRA performance of large retail banks, a retail test and a community development test. That responds to the overwhelming stakeholder feedback we heard about the vital importance of both retail and community development activities counting separately. In the ANPR, each of these tests would have a subtest that focuses on financing and a subtest that focuses on services, resulting in 4 overall subtests for large retail banks. Secondly, it proposes evaluating a bank's retail lending and its major product lines using metrics that measure the number of loans a bank makes to LMI individuals, LMI communities, not the dollar value of those loans. As a result, a larger mortgage loan would count the same as a smaller dollar mortgage. We think this is important to avoid inadvertent incentives to serve borrowers seeking to finance higher priced homes at the expense of lower income borrowers seeking finance for lower priced homes. Third, the ANPR proposes combining consideration of community development loans and qualified investments, including originations and purchases, into a single metrics-based community development financing subtest. We believe this could encourage the provision of patient capital because both new originations and those already on the balance sheet would be included in the evaluation metric. Fourth, stakeholders have emphasized the critical importance of CRA-motivated capital as a source of funding for affordable rental and single-family housing for LMI populations. Given the significant unmet need, the ANPR provides an opportunity to carefully reconsider how we define affordable housing in the regulations and how we can strengthen existing provisions for the creation and provision of affordable housing, both rental and owner-occupied. The ANPR proposes some new language that would specify that a housing unit would be considered affordable if it's purchased, developed, rehabilitated, or preserved in conjunction with a federal, state, local, or tribal government affordable housing program or subsidy, with the bona fide intent of providing affordable housing. This definition is intended to capture a wide variety of subsidies, including tax credit programs such as LIHTC, federal government direct subsidies, and state and local government direct subsidies. These programs could be for rental housing or home ownership. The suggested language is also intended to capture programs that don't provide monetary subsidies, but have the express intent of producing or preserving affordable housing, such as a loan in support of a land bank program, for instance. In addition, we're seeking your feedback on the important goal of preserving unsubsidized housing that is affordable to LMI households and ensuring units retain their affordability in gentrifying areas. In response to these concerns, the ANPR seeks to clarify the criteria under which banks can receive CRA consideration for investing in unsubsidized or naturally occurring affordable housing. We're also considering other options to ensure that housing-related community development financing maintain long-term affordability, limit displacement, and encourage affordable housing located in all communities. Finally, the ANPR seeks feedback on extending to CDFIs the status that is extended to minority depository institutions, women-owned financial institutions, and low-income credit unions that would effectively give banks CRA consideration for loans, investments, or services in conjunction with a CDFI anywhere in the country. Additionally, the ANPR discusses granting automatic CRA community development consideration for qualified activities in conjunction with U.S. Treasury to certified CDFIs for activities in a bank's assessment area. So that was just a rapid overview. The ANPR is, as I'm sure you know, very long, but those are a few of the provisions that are most relevant. And I look forward to your feedback on modernizing the CRA in a way that supports affordable housing and promotes housing-related credit and investment to LMI and minority individuals and communities. So with that, let me hand it back to David.
Thank you very much, Governor Brainard. I really appreciate you coming and such detailed remarks. It's incredibly helpful. I also want to just note for people that Governor Brainard and the Federal Reserve Board have really been doing very broad consultations with this for over 2 years. And a lot of that feedback is reflected in this incredibly thoughtful and detailed ANPR. When we started this process, the hope was that all three regulators would find themselves on the same page. I know that there were some really sincere and concerted efforts to find that common ground. For banks around the country, it can be, as you are aware, very confusing to have 2 or 3 sets of regulations in the same area. Can you give us a sense, you talked about this a little bit, but how do you see the prospects for getting consensus among the regulators? And have you talked to your colleagues at the OCC and the FDIC on how that might proceed?
Well, I certainly have kept in close communication with both Brian Brooks of the OCC and Yelena McWilliams of the FDIC. You know, they were part of the consultation process as we were contemplating going out with an ANPR. We certainly wanted them to be aware that we were still working on the proposal. And of course, we have been in contact with staff as well to take them through the provisions. We put the long comment period, 120 days, which takes us well into February of next year, with the express intent of providing plenty of time to get together across the 3 agencies. And, you know, we hope that the feedback that is provided on the specific proposals that we have in the ANPR would help inform all 3 agencies. We would then be able to start talking about perhaps a consistent approach. We're also mindful that the OCC rule does not actually go into implementation for several years because of the data collection requirements. And so that also gives us a very substantial and welcome window to see whether in fact we can move forward on a consistent approach across the 3 agencies. Certainly, I will say for the board, we do not think a good outcome would be separate rules. We really do want to see a consistent approach.
Thank you. And just as a reminder to Advisory Council and board members, if you'd like to ask a question, please use the raise hand button. If you click on your participants list and your chat box will come up, and you can use the raise hand button, or you can send me a note in the chat box and we'll recognize you. Be sure to turn on your camera and your microphone because you're muted is the cliche of the year. With that, let me ask this question. You know, one of the things that's been very challenging, and we've had a lot of focus on issues around racial equity this year. It's not new to many of us, but it's certainly been raised as a much more prominent issue, is the issue of how we deal with underserved groups, specifically racial groups, that people of color who have been discriminated against for years and for decades and for centuries, and frankly, but in terms of banking and the modern banking system, you know, formal legal discrimination ended in 1968. When CRA was put in place, it was in part because there was a realization that just making it illegal was not enough, and an incentive was needed that would really drive this. Unfortunately, it also punted on the challenge of addressing racial inequality directly, focused us instead on low and moderate income census tracts. And in many areas, particularly in home ownership, that's very difficult. Let me just remind everybody to please make sure you are muted. And Andrea, you can feel free to mute folks as necessary. But the is that, you know, in home ownership, LMI census tracts are oftentimes the least impactful. And so how do you see CRA really addressing the issues of racial equality and equity in when the statute focuses so directly on low and moderate income?
Yeah. So as you say, the statute itself is silent on the issue, although it was intended to address systemic inequities and redlining in particular. And if you go back to those redlined maps and you read the description of, you know, sort of what factors were taken into account to outline an area in red as not, you know, not, it's too risky from a credit perspective. It has demographic composition is one of the chief factors, descriptors. So it was clearly addressing racial inequities. And clearly racial inequities, as I cited a little bit, but you know, the data and the evidence there is overwhelming. They persist and remain very challenging. So what we did is we are explicit about that history, and we ask how should that history, given the core purpose rooted in that history, how should that be addressed today, and how should that be expressed in the actual regulation? And you'll notice that the second question in the ANPR is a broad-based question, which is precisely on this question: what additional modifications and changes would stakeholders suggest to address systemic inequities in credit access and financial access associated with race? And so we are looking for feedback of additional things. We also retain that very important and strengthen, in fact, the nexus to fair lending, because it's pretty clear in our minds that unless you are satisfying fair lending, you're clearly not addressing the needs of your full community. And so that nexus, we think, is very important. We're very clear that it needs to be strengthened. And we also talk about various ways to be able to provide credit for investing in underserved areas, historically and systemically underserved areas that may be outside of assessment areas. And, you know, increasingly, those are areas where branches are no longer present or never were present. And so we're looking to provide credit and we provide a variety of proposals looking for feedback there.
Thanks. Taking a little wider lens in terms of COVID-19, can you talk a little bit about both the impact on the economy as a whole, but particularly the impact on homeowners? And, in the rental space, there is no equity to draw from. So people who have missed rent, who can't pay a month's worth of rent, are not going to be able to pay 6 or 9 months. So it's very clear in that space that rental assistance is the only way we're going to avoid a massive eviction crisis. But when it comes to homeowners, forbearance has been the main strategy, and mortgage payment deferral is kind of the gold standard. It goes on the back end of the payment or when you sell your house. But that also really is funding what could be a federal program using homeowners' equity, weakening their family balance sheet and weakening the strength of the loans themselves for lenders and investors. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of how we see that going forward, particularly given your experience in the Great Recession and being at Treasury in 2009 when we had to deal with a lot of this?
Yeah, so everything hinges on how long the pandemic persists and how much support is provided to avoid recessionary dynamics from setting in. We had a really fantastic response at the federal level. The fiscal support was well targeted. It was appropriately scaled. At the Federal Reserve, our emergency facilities and monetary policy support were able to work alongside of that, and that really made a huge difference. We see that in the research. Lower and moderate income families spent out a lot of those stimulus checks, and their consumption levels were maintained to a greater extent than we would have seen otherwise. And of course, the foreclosure, the forbearance on mortgage payments, the eviction moratoria, those have been vitally important given the level of unemployment that we've seen. Now, the good news is we saw a good bounce back in the third quarter. A lot of people on temporary layoff went back to work. The bad news is we still have 7.9% unemployment, and a lot of people have left the labor force again. So we need to sustain that support, and it needs to be targeted on people that are experiencing unemployment or reduced hours or unable to work for other reasons, in order to give them those cash resources to allow them to start making those payments on their mortgages or on rent if these moratoria do expire as they're supposed to, and if the forbearance is not extended. The alternative, which is to see these stopgap measures expire at the same time, that no additional fiscal support for unemployment, for just emergency payments, for state and local governments. If all of those things kind of go the wrong way, we will see a much more protracted and challenging situation, particularly for low and moderate income households, particularly for Black and Latinx households. But that will slow and reduce the momentum of the overall recovery for the entire economy.
Thank you. I think Ann McCulloch, our board chair, has a question. Ann, just turn on your camera and your microphone and go for it.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Governor Brainard. We all really appreciate the very thoughtful approach the Fed has taken to CRA reform. And I'm with Housing Partnership Equity Trust, a public purpose REIT, so particularly appreciate the Fed's recognition of the importance of naturally occurring affordable housing for the vitality of our communities and for the residents who depend on it. Really appreciated the focus of the CRA proposal by the Fed put on accepting NOAA housing as an acceptable category for CRA lending and investment. And particularly wondered if the Fed would consider supporting lending and investment in NOAA housing where landlords are willing to add voluntary restrictions for the duration of a loan or equity investment if the housing is in higher income neighborhoods where it's particularly at risk.
So among the commentary in the ANPR is precisely this important qualification that this kind of housing should be given consideration wherever it occurs, and it need not be restricted or should not be restricted to LMI areas, but that the important characteristics are that there will be a long-term commitment to affordability, which sounds like what you are suggesting, and so that those populations do not later become displaced. And so we really heard that theme in the feedback on the sort of proposals that have been out there and on our roundtables. We reflected it in our ANPR, and we tried to put forward some precise definitions and approaches. And we're really just looking for specific feedback. The more comment letters, the better, on particularly those kinds of issues.
Thank you. Let's go to Dan Nissenbaum, California.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Governor Brainard. And I echo what Ann said in terms of being grateful for your personal support and your advocacy. I appreciate your staff, which has done yeoman's work to produce this ANPR. And also thank you for your support of CDFIs, particularly relative to mortgage-backed securities, which many in our industry don't believe should receive CRA credit at all, but that's a different topic. I wanted to talk about ask you about the issue of deposits. Certainly we care about the investment test and the national assessment area. Those are really important. But an issue that I don't think has received as much attention is sort of this question on which deposits count. In the OCC's reg, they obviously have increased the numerator and decreased the denominator. And while the ratio approach may not be exactly as the same, my understanding is that the question of which deposits count could be or might be an issue still in the Fed's approach, and we think is as significant. So for wholesale banks, internet banks, this question of sweep or broker deposits, distinct from deposits gathered in a branch, is crucial. We think it will absolutely reduce the amount of CRA volumes significantly. I've already been told directly that by a banker. So I just wanted to get your opinion and insight on that question. Thank you.
Yep. So it's a good question. It's a really important issue because where we do propose using metrics, the question is always, what do we scale against? And what would be ideal, of course, is if we had at the ready data on deposits from retail customers and from business customers locally, and we were able to distinguish that in the data. That would make the community development financing test a lot easier in particular, because we are looking to not just aggregate community development investments, but to put in place a metric, a comparator for each assessment area to say, well, what would be a satisfactory level relative to the size of a bank's capacity, which is well measured by deposits. As you know, the data is not good. It's not precise, and so with the data that the FDIC collects, there are certain things that one can do to improve that. For instance, excluding broker deposits and really focusing on locally gathered deposits, and so that's something that we also ask about in the ANPR. When you go outside of assessment areas, it gets very complicated, as you know, because that deposit data is not gathered by the location of the depositor. And so that's one of the reasons the data collection burden is a real issue in these kinds of approaches. And so, we basically looking across banks, find that a large majority of banks do a large majority of their activity actually in their branch-based assessment areas. So it's a smaller set of banks for which this issue is a really important issue. It's important for internet only, and it's also important for large retail banks that do a preponderance of their activity outside their assessment areas. And for those, we ask questions about gathering that very specific data. But in terms of narrowing existing deposit data along the lines you suggest, that's certainly something that we also think is very sensible and put in the proposal.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And just to note that Dan is with the Low Income Investment Fund. Barry?
Thanks, David, and Governor Brainard, thank you for joining us today. And thanks for all your support for CRA and community investment generally. I wanted to ask you a broader question keyed off of this, which is back when the CRA was enacted, as you referenced in your remarks, it was really in response to an environment in the banking industry which denied that there was any problem with services in low and moderate income areas, had to be sort of forced to the table through HMDA and CRA. And I think we're in a much different environment today where most major lenders accept the responsibilities of CRA and are actively involved. Nothing's perfect, of course. So I wanted to ask you, from your perch at the Fed and your experience at other places, as you step back, where do you see the white space that's left unoccupied, left unexplored by America's banking institutions? And sort of by reference to what you're hoping to do with the CRA regs, how you'd like to see private financial institutions moved into those areas, the unexplored territory of unmet need, whether it falls into the neat boxes that CRA's statute enables you to address.
Yeah, well, it's a good question. Let me just start by saying I really would echo your observation that the work on the CRA revealed a huge amount of common ground between lenders and community groups. Banks generally, the ones that we engage with or who want to engage with us, they like CRA and they want it to be less cumbersome. They want it to be more predictable. They want to spend less time. Many of them want to spend less time with their examiners, which I understand. But they generally get a lot of benefit from doing the kinds of activities that CRA gives them credit for. And they, so we did not see any tension there, except on the particulars of how things get measured and how cumbersome it is and how much effort certain activities require. Obviously, the financial services space is rapidly evolving, has been. And so one of the areas that, I think you're raising potentially is just that there are a lot of actors who are providing credit and investments who are not subject to CRA and who are important in these communities as well. And of course, they're counted in our proposed metrics, but they don't have the same kind of obligations. And some of them have the potential to provide a lot of financial inclusion. So that's certainly an area that's well outside the scope of the statute. But given that when the statute was written, non-bank financial intermediaries were a much, much smaller portion of that landscape, it's certainly something that bears consideration. There are a variety of other areas that we do tackle in the rule. And one of the biggest ones, as I'm sure you know, is just the question of underserved areas, areas that really would benefit hugely from greater credit access, greater financial inclusion, greater community development investments, but have simply been scoped out traditionally to a large degree because of the absence of bank branches. And as banks, sort of pull back on branches in some of those areas, it's a very important question of how to ensure that there is credit for those kinds of activities, because they're very high value, both for those communities and for our economy overall.
Thanks, Barry. Marietta Rodriguez from NeighborWorks.
Good afternoon, Governor Brainard. We really appreciate the ANPR and the effort and work behind it from your team. Probably not surprising to you, NeighborWorks is really concerned about rural and Native American communities, what could be classified as current CRA deserts. And there's a substantial increase in communities with no bank headquarters, no bricks and mortar, particularly in rural communities. And they're closing branches in some cases. And then the challenges of that are even magnified with the lack of broadband in those communities as well, and the ability to access internet. Can you explain more about how you and your team think about branches and how they would work in the proposed ANPR, especially for those communities that don't have a bricks and mortar branch or very few options?
Yeah. So, like NeighborWorks, the Federal Reserve spends a lot of time, around the country in communities that are very challenged. I've certainly done many trips to those communities because it's really valuable to be on the ground to appreciate just how significant the challenges are if you do not have a bank branch locally. Even more so if broadband is very challenged, cellular is challenged in some cases. And of course, those are precisely the areas that suffer structural disinvestment. So we did spend a lot of time thinking about those issues, and they crop up in several different places in the ANPR. On the one hand, we did want to give credit. Branches are important. And communities that have branches care a lot about them, and they should receive credit. So you will see that in the retail services subtest, which is mostly qualitative, but we want to keep that emphasis on products that are targeted to LMI individuals, services or hours like non-English language services that are provided in those branches, after hours, so people who have challenging work schedules can access those branches. So we do go into some detail on that. For areas that are outside of headquarters or branch-based assessment areas, we suggest a variety of ways to provide credit. Internet banks, we ask about just a nationwide assessment area so that activities undertaken in underserved areas would receive full credit without any sort of minimum associated with a particular geographic area. And we also ask about various different ways to provide credit for investments in activity in underserved areas, either at the state ranking, at the rating, at the multi-state rating, or at the institutional level rating. And we, have also, there's some very particular challenges associated with the Indian country and the role of tribal governments. And so we also have tried to reflect that in the ANPR and the decision-making process there that might be somewhat specific. The final thing is, in the list of we do propose a list of qualifying activities that would not be exclusive, but would be illustrative. We think that was a good idea as it was in the OCC proposal. Our list might look a little different in terms of the scope. We might put more of a focus on LMI benefits, but we think that certainty would also be helpful to underserved areas.
Thank you. And now Mark Willis in New York.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Governor. The question I have is, again, kind of a broad one, is that you've laid out a number of very interesting tests and interesting ideas about including more geographies in the consideration here, particularly deserts you mentioned. I'm wondering what thought you have given to the idea of how are you going to create an institutional-wide rating? How do you put all that together? And even within states, how do you put it together? And it may be easier at the metro, but maybe even there, you've got a lot a lot of pieces here. And, in some cases you, I think, still have assessment areas for just the main office. How are you going to think about all those components going together?
We actually do provide pretty detailed proposals on ratings, which I actually really pushed for because I think it's really important to just put out there a straw man of how things are going to get added up, and then let people really stare at it and come back to us on it. So I think for retail lending, for the metrics test, it's kind of easier. We take the assessment areas, we add them up. We have 2 different proposals for how you might add them up and weight them. And similarly for the in-assessment area community development financing activities. For statewide, for multi-state or regional, and for institutional, we also do provide some alternatives. What we don't do is, well, I guess we put out there as a question, would you support a weighting scheme? We don't actually think it's a great idea because we don't know where those weights would come from. So instead, we provide some alternatives. We ask about impact scores, which would be simpler and sort of less less subject to being wrong, just because they would be simpler. But we essentially provide both how you would add things up and also how you might weight them. And then mostly, there is no clear answer for that. So we're really looking for feedback because institutions that are being rated and communities for whose activities will receive more or less credit as a result of those ratings will have a very granular sense of how that's going to impact them. And that's really what we need.
Thank you. Again, if you have questions, raise your hand. Let me come back to this issue of deserts and hotspots. And this is a really been a frustrating piece of CRA as for those of us who are looking at this on a nationwide footprint. The deserts issue, I think, is pretty easy to understand. You're just not seeing the incentive in many of these rural areas and other underserved areas. You've talked a little bit about that. What about the hotspots? How do you see a new CRA addressing hotspots? One of the frustrations we had with the OCC is that they really talked a lot about this as an issue, but I think in aggregate, the concern is it is probably neutral or may actually contribute to hotspots in some areas. Can you talk a little bit about that, where you see the NPR and kind of the direction you think we need to go in?
Yeah, so for internet banks and wholesale banks, we provide specific proposals for getting activity more credit in underserved areas. The one thing that we did get a little stuck on is that, again, we think it's important to be able to scale community development financing so that you have benchmarks, both at the local level, at the national level. We actually propose doing rural differently than metro because they're just the community development infrastructure is just more challenging in rural areas. And so, it just would be inappropriate to have the same benchmark. The difficulty, I think, with any way that you can scale those kinds of things, either on a deposit basis where you're gathering your deposits or where your lending activity is based, it may actually serve to reinforce that hotspots dynamic. And so, we're not able to do it with deposits for the reasons I said earlier. We don't have the deposit data outside of branch-based FDIC data. But we did do it for lending data, publicly available lending data, and we were, we put that into the ANPR. It did result in what you might worry about, which is that those same hotspot areas have the higher areas of lending concentration, probably also deposit concentration, and as a result, unless you adjust for that in some way, you may end up further concentrating activity unless you're very careful. But we do just explicitly state that and also suggest that as a result, it may not be a very attractive approach.
Thank you. You have done a lot of really interesting work in developing a model for performance context. And this is an area that I know when I was at Treasury and we were working on the Treasury memo to regulators came up over and over again. And this balance between having more clarity, which everybody wants, but also having flexibility. And the two of those can be different sides of a seesaw. So can you talk a little bit about performance context and the broader issue of balancing clarity and flexibility?
Yeah, it's just a theme that runs throughout, and you will see it in the OCC proposal as well. That there are just certain areas where they just sort of nod to examiner judgment. What we did was constructed a database. The staff put together, I want to say, 6,000 institutions' performance evaluations over a several year stretch, a fairly lengthy period. And they tried to see the extent to which they could create comparators and compare the actual activity of individual institutions against local comparators and see whether those stacked up pretty well against performance ratings. And it turned out for retail lending, you really can do that. It's pretty good. And where the ratings deviated, it was because of institution-specific factors. But a lot of the comparators that examiners use for performance context are based on publicly available data that we were able to put into specific to localities comparators. And the result of that is you're not asking an institution to do the same share of LMI lending in an area where there's a huge LMI relative to share population as in an area where it may be very small and difficult to reach. And that's really important. It's also very important over the business cycle to not have a fixed comparator, but to allow the whole market to vary. With regard to some areas, it really did require a lot of qualitative adjustments and qualitative performance context. And I would say that was more the case in the community development area, because we simply do not have that same kind of database. We can't construct it because banks don't report data at the assessment area level with the same kind of consistency. And moreover, there's no public database of comparators. So you'll see in that section, we ask a lot of questions about how much certainty do you want versus how much qualitative judgment do you want, given that there's no data record to calibrate against.
Thanks, that's very helpful. Let's go back to Dan, who has a question.
And since David already introduced me and I forgot the first time, I suppose I don't have to do that again. I apologize for that. My question here, Governor, may best be phrased by asking how you think we can be most helpful to the Fed in terms of the comments around the issue of investment, the community development investment test. Again, I see in the proposal that there is a community development test. That's fantastic. And I see that that could contain debt or equity. And obviously we believe equity is imperative. Part of what CRA calls for, want to keep that aligned with other government imperatives and programs like LIHTC and the New Markets program. And again, superseding mortgage-backed securities. So I believe that there should be an investment test, but given the proposal, what would be most useful? Is it input around where the impact metrics could be prioritized, emphasized, weighted? Is it information about why an investment test should be preserved? What would your guidance be there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I feel like we are pretty firmly convinced that retail lending and community development financing should be separate and evaluated on different basis and aggregated together in different ways. What we are challenged by is there's just much less market data on community development. It's very specific to individual institutions. We don't know where, we really just don't have a database in particular assessment areas. So we propose, as you say, in order to emphasize patient capital, we put lending and equity investments in the same place. We have both, inclusive of both on balance sheet ongoing exposures as well as new originations. That was, there was discrepancy there before. We saw no reason for that. So, if that works, then, please let us know. But what I think we'll still be challenged by is, so how much is enough? And what is that benchmark or set of benchmarks that would help us translate that into a performance expectation, the way that we now feel we can pretty easily do for retail lending in each product line. Just because we have, we have HMDA data, we have certain types of loan data publicly, and then of course, we have loan counts for each institution divided into LMI and non-LMI. We just don't have the same kind of thing for community development investments. There are other things. Obviously, we suggest a qualifying list, feedback on what that should look like, how frequently it should be updated, should it go out for notice and comment, or should we just put it out? And also, we propose a ex-ante process for getting qualification. We heard a lot from both banks and community institutions that banks just don't really want to put all the energy into, a new type of investment if they aren't absolutely certain how much credit it's going to get ahead of time. And so, we also throw out some questions about what should we structure that to look like.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to wrap up with the last question here. First of all, thank you so much for your time and all the work that you've done. And you've really made such an amazing difference in this whole conversation around CRA. As we've been very clear, there were a lot of frustrating issues around the OCC's rule, and being able to revisit some of these issues and continue the conversation officially is incredibly important. I want to just widen the lens a little bit here and look at the broader issue of COVID and the economy. I think there's a lot of stimulus that is in the economy. We, had multi-trillion-dollar supports, and now we're talking about trillions of dollars more. The Fed is responsible for both helping us get out of recessions and avoid inflation. And given the amount of stimulus that we have and see coming, where is the point where, where is the line? How do you all think about the throttle and ensuring, and in fact, are we actually quite far from where that line is, or is it something you're concerned about?
Well, we always are very focused on the goals that Congress gave us. And in monetary policy, that's maximum employment and the price stability. And we've defined that as 2% inflation. Inflation has actually been running below 2% now for over a decade in terms of the underlying trend. And right now, given that the unemployment rate is 7.9%, and businesses, a lot of businesses are still, at well below capacity, airlines, hotels, restaurants, bars, just a whole variety of areas that are, at 50%, and that, many small businesses are really, just trying to eke out a little more, sort of length of time before, while they wait for revenues to increase. there's just a ton of unused capacity in the economy. This is not the environment in which one would expect to see a sustained burst of high inflation. Quite the reverse. The economy really requires significant support on both the fiscal and the monetary policy side in order not to get recessionary dynamics becoming entrenched. Because once those dynamics start to become entrenched, you actually need a lot more work to get us back to maximum employment. And so by helping to support demand, particularly among those communities that we've been talking about here today, frontline workers, workers that have been laid off, Black and Latinx communities that have really seen their unemployment levels go up by more and come down more slowly. And those who are struggling to make their rental payments, by helping support their incomes, it's actually very beneficial, not just to those families, but to the overall robustness of demand and growth rate of the economy overall. So this is a time to make sure that those income shortfalls are addressed. And that's really a job for the fiscal authorities.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining us. It's been a great hour, and you can be sure that NHC and our members will be providing you with a very detailed comment letter on the ANPR, and look forward to working with you and all of your fellow governors of the Federal Reserve.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for all the engagement on the part of NHC and your members. It's been really, really valuable to us. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Barry and Jackie.